This podcast episode contains strong language and sexual references. Is it like silk, hidden in leaves of refuge, waiting in waves, floating, craving, silk-like or snake-like, softly ancient and heavy, breathing life to host and any? Is it like silk?
As much as I do actually think, okay, and as much as it isn't good now, like it needs to go a long, long way, I do feel like it is better.
Yeah, I think 200-300 years ago it was like purely anatomical for reproduction purposes, and now people, it is more viewed as like an innate or something that we need, like one of our basic human needs. I think, not just for reproductive measures, but in a textbook, like I think it was from I read like an article and it was an excerpt from a textbook from like 1990s. It said, it was a description of what sex is, and it said like the male inserts his penis inside to the female vagina, reaches an orgasm. Sometimes maybe the female might have an orgasm, which I thought was like interesting, kind of like, what the fuck? Why wouldn't, like, because clearly that's not, first of all that's not the only type of sex. That's not sex. A penis inside a vagina, that's not sex. That's the first flaw with that whole statement. But that blew my mind. I was like, what? And the female may have an orgasm? Okay.
So when I was younger and I was first learning about orgasms, and you know, people were talking about you learning it in school, it used to be a thing that was mine, that, okay, so I'm going to give this to, like, you used to wonder how, you know, that would happen, and it's all about you and how you would do that. And now I look at it as how a guy is going to do that. So I think that's, like, quite a big thing, you know, that it used to be, it used to be mine, and now it's something that the guy will give me.
Yeah, I feel like people, they rarely, like, females don't admit as much that they masturbate, that they give themselves an orgasm.
It's not as okay to talk about as like guys masturbate, because it's normal for them. Whereas if we say we do it at all, it's like shocking, which, you know, and even though it's the most normal thing to do.
Yeah, it's an innate response, like it is a human need. Yeah. It's like, definitely. Essentially, I think it is. It's a part of, like, it's like hunger to satisfy yourself sexually. And I think that it's frowned upon more for females to masturbate, or to openly admit they're not as comfortable to say, you know, like, I masturbate, I satisfy myself sexually. I think it's a massive difference there.
Yeah. If we say we do it once, it's a massive shock.
Another interesting thing, though, is some women don't have an orgasm with penetration.
Yeah.
It's just oral sex. And what I find interesting about that is that some people don't consider oral sex to be sex. So I think that's quite a traditional view, but some people still hold that view. Honestly, I had more of the view, like, that penetration would be like how you would reach an orgasm, and I didn't actually think of it more as individually. I think I had more of a thought it would be something that happens with someone. And I don't know if it's because, like, it was shied away from conversation that I would masturbate myself, but I don't actually remember thinking it was normal for girls to masturbate. But I remember, like, on TV shows and stuff, like, you hear jokes, and as you get older you see stuff like you didn't get when you were younger, where it's always more like men masturbating, but
or giving it to you.
Yeah. But I remember one of my best friends, like, opened it to me about how she does it, and I hadn't masturbated yet at this point. But and then I obviously, I wanted to see what the fuss was about.
What age did you first, like,
masturbate?
Yeah,
probably when I was 15, 14,
13. people are having sex a lot younger. Because, yeah, there's a lot of porn sites easily accessible to everyone. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff on there that's really degrading towards women. And I think, if you're watching that, that's going to be put onto you. And then you're going to think it's acceptable to treat other people like that. I think that's a big thing. There's a lot of
porn websites.
Yeah, there's a lot of really degrading, dominating stuff, which is, if a girl likes that, that's fine. But also because there's so much there that it puts you under pressure majorly when you should be enjoying that.
Yeah, and the guys, how blank are guys' facial expressions in porn? And the girls are so over exaggerated, ridiculous, moaning sounds, That's not how actual sex is all the time.
No, not
at
all.
And guys moan too.
The majority, you find a lot of stuff that it's guys, dominating women, them on top. I read a lot of erotic novels, but I don't watch a lot of porn, so... And a lot of them, I would say it's still...
It's very much the guy.
The guy giving it to the girl.
And that just goes back to the fact that guys and girls both have innate sexual desires and needs that's completely normal.
Yeah.
But it's more normalised for men too.
Even though it's completely it's in our nature. Yeah. So if you're a lesbian couple, I think you just... Well, I know having the conversation with my cousin, she said it's exactly the same. She's had sex with a guy and she's had sex with a girl and she's had, there's toys, there's all sort of different things you can do that it's just as good. And she definitely feels it's not, society doesn't deem it as sex. And when you think about it, I think because, it's bad. Because, it really, takes them out of, the norm and, categorises them even more. So, it's not very nice.
Yeah, it almost takes away the meaning. How meaningful their sex is.
Exactly, yeah.
Hi there, I'm Alice. Thank you for listening in. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about a topic that probably seems as common as alien to the lot of us. Female sexuality. During my gender, sexuality and diversity studies, I grew more and more curious of what the conceptions on female sexuality were today and what they were before. I guess I experienced a contradiction. Society telling me we have moved forward, and the curriculum telling me not so much. Therefore, in this episode, I have asked people for their thoughts on the female sexuality, our discourses on it in today's society, and also what they think the discourse was before. What really is female sexuality? How do we understand it? Britt Marie Schiller writes in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association that there are to present day no conceptual framework for representing female sexual desire. In her opinion, nearly none of the representations of female sexuality is elaborated without the male framework. In other words, it's not seen independently without male genitalia. This kind of sex is seen as neutral in our society, whilst anything that falls outside of this is something different and needs added wording. The female sexuality is othered, in other words. Are there any implications to this, though, you might think? Why does this matter? Interestingly, this thinking might actually show itself in our daily lives and when we seek, for example, medical help. A friend of mine went to the doctors recently for a smear test. She's at that age where they recommend that sort of testing. The doctor nearly refused to do the test, as my friend is a lesbian and, in his opinion, doesn't have sex. Whether there are medical reasons for his viewpoint, I'm not going to comment on. I'm no doctor. But what I found interesting was his wording. My friend doesn't have sex. An excellent example to Schiller's point, is it not?
really easily, and like it's like a guaranteed thing if you have sex with them that they're going to have an orgasm. I don't think anyone realises exactly how much work it takes to get there.
No one, because literally I was in a relationship last year, didn't have an orgasm. It was 2 years I'd been with him, and he didn't realise at all, and I just thought I was not capable of it. But now that I do know it can happen, it's like a good thing, and people need to put effort in to do it, definitely, to make it work.
I think there's still quite a gender biased opinion, because like the whole men can sleep around and they're a stud and they're considered like really cool for doing it, but if a girl says that she's had a couple of different sexual partners, then instantly she's labelled as like a slag and stuff, and people look down on them. And I don't think in this day and age it should really be like frowned upon for women to be like that. It's their prerogative. If that's what they want to do, then that's what they do.
Yeah, exactly.
Like boys go on nights out like just for the intention to pull and get called lads by like the groups of mates, but if like girls go out and do that, they're like called slutty and all that by like most girls, to be fair. But like for boys, that's just kind of what people think about them, like, oh, they're just trying to pull, that's why they're here. But like especially like, even if you're walking down the street and you'll get like a group of men or lads shout something at you, but like nobody'd expect girls to do that, and if they did, it'd be a bit like, whoa, where's that come from?
If you're like trying to get a boy, they'd be like, oh, she's well keen now, like I'm not going to go for
and
that.
if they did like get with the boy straight away, they'd just be called easy. Whereas like obviously the boy's the one that's trying it on, but it's like
Also, girls are really weird around each other. Like some girls will be like, oh, you can sleep with whoever you want, it don't matter, like we don't care. But then some girls are also like, oh no, I only sleep with one boy, only my boyfriend, and all this and that. It's like proper like you don't know where you stand even with your mates sometimes.
I believe that during the ancient times, worshipping, mentioning, and loving woman orgasm was something like completely natural in the society of people. They were considering a celebration of life, but during the course of history, that changed significantly. We reached the point during religion expansion that it was considered a taboo matter, and those that were worshipping any similar things were considered to be like outcasts or part of sects. They were handed down or were extracted from the society, and we can see that this is something that can happen in any matter, and it happened to women orgasm and women worshipping as well. And today we reached the point that we consider this matter to be a taboo. Nobody will really discuss about it. It might even be considered an uncivilized matter of discussion, and we reached the point where we might try to use arts, paintings, music, or whatever feels right to express our feelings towards that matter, so that we avoid public judgment and still be able to express our feelings towards a woman's orgasm and loving women, which I believe is something completely natural, and it's just a way of celebrating life.
I bet you have heard of Medusa, the woman with snakes on her head instead of hair. She has been portrayed in films such as the 2010 Clash of the Titans. She's been subject for multiple books, art and paintings, and in the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, written in 8 AD. Today, she has even been made into a Barbie doll. There are multiple versions of the myth of Medusa, and also multiple versions of her. Some, like the version by Lucian, tells Medusa as such an overwhelmingly beautiful being that she turned people to stone just by the awe of looking at her. Others say she was a hideous creature, exuberating evil. But even in her monstrosity, she is portrayed as a seductress, despite her snaky hair. The myth of Medusa most likely originated from the classical Greek period, from around 500 BCE till 336 BCE. And the most common myth of her story goes like this. Medusa was a beautiful human, one of the Gorgon sisters, daughters of earth and the sea. She was seduced and raped by Poseidon in the holy temple of the Virgin Athena. For devastating her temple Athena punished Medusa, turning her into a monster. Her once long, beautiful hair was turned into venomous snakes. Some myths even depict her with horns in her skull and her face with deep wrinkles and a bearded chin. Without going into the problematic beauty standards depicted here that we are still battling today, possibly excluding the horns though, the rest of the tale goes that Perseus, son of Zeus, was tasked to slay Medusa. But to be able to do this, he must not look directly at her, but use a mirror instead, or else he would turn to stone. He managed to decapitate her head, and later used it to turn his enemies to stone. Quite the gruesome story, isn't it? There are many elements to the story that refers to female sexuality. Even though being punished for being raped in the Virgin Athena's temple might seem foreign, it might also be, unfortunately, quite familiar, as speaking out about rape is no easy thing to this day, as the misplaced feel of shame is still very much a part of it. So why am I telling you about Medusa? Well, according to Dr. Doris Silverman, myths are important for our mental understanding and perception of the world around us. Handed down from generation to generation, they generate our subconsciousness, resonating with our fantasies, desires and fears. And these myths might actually have an impact on our view on female sexuality then and even today. The myth shows the discourses, the society and culture of the time of its origin, and lives on through current fantasies, wishes and fears. Dr. Silverman contends that Medusa's story can bear two meanings. Even though it can be argued that the myth of Medusa portrays and possibly reproduces a fearful look of the female sexuality and its argued mysteriousness, Dr. Silverman has a second take on the myth as well, of liberating importance, which might offer freedom to oppressed women. Medusa was eventually turned into a symbol of warfare, a protection against enemies. I guess there can be said to be some empowering details to her story, being able to turn possible assassins to stone being one of them. On the other hand though, Medusa is arguably a picture on how female sexuality has been seen in the past, and maybe even today. Dr. Silverman even argues that Medusa's head of venomous snakes may symbolise her tormenting sexuality and aggression, even though Freud's take on it was phallocentric, meaning that the snake symbolises the penis and the need to decapitate her head portrays the fear of castration. That was Freud's take on it anyways. For Greek women, secondary citizens to men of the time, Medusa's story showed a possible representation of strength in their gender, a symbolic figure of independence and fierce power. However, of that time, female sexuality was greatly ignored by men. Women's sexual appetite was seen as different to men's, a place for procreation and nothing more. Women were seen as lustful, but not in any other way than physiologically. Orgasms or orgasmic pleasure was non-existent, and pleasure was gained through a husband's penetration only. Dr. Silverman argues that this must mean there was a great deal of dissociation from their bodies. As we know today, female sexuality is so much more than this. An interesting contradiction here is then the need for subduing of the female sexuality, as there sure seemed to be a need to tame women in their sexual desires. Much has changed in today's society, but there might still be a view on female sexuality as something that should be tamed. Perhaps the myth of Medusa and the discourses around it is still relevant today.
Going back to like Victorian times, where obviously it was quite repressed, and then frowned upon if anyone was to do anything outlandish, chaperones, etc., etc. But like obviously we had the sexual like awakening, revolution in the 60s, like catalyzed by the invention of like the pill and stuff like that, and fashion and the miniskirts and etc. I don't know how much it's changed in Europe since then. We seem to be pretty much, well, flatlining. But in like places like Iran, it would potentially taken like a few steps back. Back in the 60s, you see women going around in miniskirts, and nowadays it's the complete opposite.
Just from what I've seen in the media, I think that because there's been like a, inequality for so many years, I think I notice a lot of hostility, like, the message that I get is that women can do what men can do, but the way it's portrayed, or at least the way I see it, is in an aggressive way, as in like, coming from a victim's point of view, like, we can do this, so don't tell us we can't, or don't oppress. And I'm not a woman, so I can't really say what it's like on the other side, but that's what I see. It's kind of like empowerment, but also from a victimized point of view, or like a place carrying like an undertone of victimization that has been going on for a while. It's more, I don't know, there's more leeway for being liberal with your sexuality. Like, women can do what they want, like present themselves with a lot less scrutiny, do you know what I mean? Like, you can dress how you want, and it's more acceptable now than, I guess, in the past, when it would have been frowned upon because of like religion and social constructs, and be like, oh, you can't do that. But now it's more relaxed. There's a tendency, I think, to see it as more of a fragile thing, whereas like with men it's dominance, you have to, the men are like in charge almost, and the woman's just subservient. But I don't know, there's definitely a shift in consciousness going on, and it has been going on for a long time, where people realize that, okay, women can as much as men can. Yes, I think there's still shame, because I do hear conversations that are like, on the topic of how people dress, how women dress, and certain guys have this whole, girls should feel responsible for the way they dress, otherwise they're like asking for whatever negative attention they get, whereas it would be ideal if we could all be like, just do what you want, and everyone's personally responsible. Everyone is responsible for their own urges and takes responsibility, instead of being like, well, she was fucking dressed like that, did you see that, So I do think there's an element of shame linked to it still. I think there's a variety of reasons, like, because one is just historically that's been the way things have been, and people don't change overnight. And then I think there's a level of people just need to take responsibility for their, for their own actions, and not blame or shame other people as a result of the way they choose to be. So, yeah, I still think there's shame.
I think it, to me, it's sort of how we think about female sexuality falls in sort of like a broader sense of, we're still less and less so, but we're quite fearful of female agency. So I think like it's very similar to what I think of, like a lot of the fear as well of like women who are romantic as well. Like, we're quite fearful anything that sort of involves women having agency or putting something out rather than, like being on the receiving end. We kind of think of women as passive, and men are the pursuers in anything, whether it's romantic, sexual, whatever. So I think that the sort of like the fear of female sexuality falls into that camp as well, because we're not comfortable with female agency in general. But I do think like it's becoming less. I do think like I can see certainly sort of like in the last sort of 5-10 years it becoming a little less taboo, and a lot of my female friends and things are a lot more comfortable talking about it than they would have been, when we were slightly younger. I think it's like a lot of things. When I think men in particular don't often appreciate that women internalise sexism as well. I mean, we're brought up in the same culture, and we absorbed all those same ideas about gender that men did. And I think I cringe a lot when I look back at when I was younger, because you've internalised a lot of those ideas, and you're too young to have kind of thought critically. The older you get, you start to think more critically about things, particularly when you have your own experience. And I think you kind of have like an internal sense of injustice and things, and so the older you get, you start to see the way that you've kind of been messed with in a way. Like, whereas I think when I was younger, you know, I think I was a lot more judgmental of girls who dated a lot than the guys in my year who dated a lot. And I did buy into a lot of that sort of stigma about, you know, women should sort of be modest and humble, and, you know, but so yeah, I think I have become a lot more sort of open-minded and much less sort of judgmental about it. And personally, I'm not ashamed myself, you know, to talk about it or anything like that. So yeah, definitely changed a lot since I was younger. I think we think of male sexuality as being kind of inherent, almost like too much so, to the point that, like, when you watch a lot of movies and things like that, this sort of like, I wonder why boys don't feel insulted. They're kind of talked about constantly like they have bunny brains. Like there's nothing else to being a man than being constantly sort of obsessed with sex, like irrespective of what kind of guy you are or what you wear or whatever. Whereas I think women I get a bit annoyed sometimes, because I think when it comes to female sexuality, we conflate it a lot with sort of how you present yourself, sort of how you dress, and, you know, whether you take nude pics or that, like, so there's a lot of stuff when you see women who kind of pose, let's say, for Playboy, and then we talk about they're exploring their sexuality. Are they really? Or are they, you know, for me, that's sort of the point of those magazines isn't, you know, for women to sort of explore their own sex lives, or, you know, men. It's about being viewed by men. It's about, you know, it's a very passive thing to me. And I think we haven't got to the point where we've stopped conflating, you know, making yourself up and looking glamorous and posting sexy selfies with actually what sexuality and sexual agency means. So I think, like, for men, we think of it as a very inherent thing, like, irrespective of what they're wearing. Like, a guy could walk in with a hoodie and whatever, and we'd be like, yeah, he wants sex. But girls, like, if you're a girl who does that, it's like you're a prude, right? I dressed modestly a lot when I grew up, just because that's what I prefer. And I've been cast a lot in my life as a prude because I wasn't one of those girls who dressed a certain way. But it had nothing to do with how I felt about sexual agency, right? You know, so like I sort of want those ideas to stop being conflated. We haven't got to the point where we understand that women are just sexual beings inherently already. I do think we do think that things that fall short of sort of penetration by penis is not being sex, like, or serious. I think you also see it in, you know, sexual abuse cases as well. You know, like we're going through the Me Too movement, and any men that were accused of something that wasn't flat out rape, it wasn't considered serious. I think, like, we think of sex as being very sort of physical and aggressive and to do with men, and anything that kind of falls short of that we don't take seriously, sort of on an emotional level or an abusive level, and I think so. Yeah, I think it does shape how we think about sex.
One of the things I often hear is that women are very free today, and that female sexuality and what we think of it has come very far, especially compared to the Victorian era. From the sexual revolution around the 1960s and up till today, there has arguably been a different openness about female sexuality and its complexities. Tom Smith would say that the sexual revolution is the metaphor for the attitude of choice when it comes to sex. Others even call it a moral evolution. Smith argues, though, that the revolution might not have been as black and white as the media has portrayed it to be, as premarital sex, for example, was still very much frowned upon into the 80s. And Michel Foucault, a famous sociologist, would beg to differ when it comes to our progressive standpoint. He actually argues that sex and sexuality wasn't as bound in the 18th and 19th century as we seem to think today, and that it is actually a lot more controlled today than we are aware. In his book, The History of Sexuality, Foucault has this theory, the repressive hypothesis. Foucault explains this hypothesis as a progressive narrative, a discourse in today's society, thinking we were much more sexually repressed before compared to how we are today, and that sex for pleasure in the Victorian era was frowned upon and taboo. In his book, He challenges the belief that sex was controlled and sexual language and sexual openness was censored. It was for procreative purposes only, and within marriage back then is a wide-known assumption. In his hypothesis, Foucault challenges our perception of being sexually free today. Our assumption is that, because we are more open about it, we are more free. This, he argues, indicates that freedom is gained through the talking of sex. But as Foucault writes, sex was talked about in the 18th and 19th century as well. Foucault is sceptical to the assumption that censor and prohibition is the only way oppression and lack of freedom portrays itself. He argues that in fact, the Victorian focus on secretiveness and censor actually made sex more of a topic, as they had to define what was not to be talked about. They would have to categorise and map to be able to control and prohibit. So, if sex was talked about before, then what is it that possibly makes female sexuality today still a taboo and difficult subject for many? Foucault argues that without being able to see the controller, we become blind to its existence. It instead hides in our norms and discourses, where feelings of shame or abnormality might be hard to understand where come from. Perhaps we could argue some progress. There is an enhanced focus on female sexuality today. There are even sites on the internet now dedicated to educate women about their sexuality. Yet, maybe the control has changed its forms instead. There are still aspects of female sexuality that seem foreign and abnormal to many. Foucault says that sexual repression can't be bound to one day and age, but continues in its changed forms. Sex and shame is still a thing in the modern day and age, and to him, sex is still very much regulated in today's society. We are overlooking the power structures that come with language, he says, and thus we are internalising the very structures and norms we say no longer exist. If women still feel shameful for exploring their sexuality, maybe there is something to Foucault's argument.
I think it's quite difficult to view it fairly. I think in the media it's always just either end of the scale. You either have these completely submissive, repressed sex, your Handmaid's Tale kind of thing, and then at the other end you've got boobs, the Fast and the Furious, all that stuff. But I think it's getting better. Like, women can just talk about orgasms, sex, all that stuff, and no one's really going to judge you for it. I think LGBT positivity has kind of gone towards that, because people kind of put the two hand in hand as two sort of repressed sexuality groups. And as one moves forward, I think the other moves forward by proxy. Well, as a man, I think men's is portrayed in quite a very hedonistic way. You're going out, you're shagging two people a night, you're doing drugs, whatever, that kind of stereotypical, the Wolf of Wall Street model. But by the same token, there's things like the in-betweeners, and that kind of thing, it's viewed in a lot more nuance than women's. There's very little representation of one end of the scale as people who just don't have sex, asexuals. Very few portrayals of that in the media. But it's there's a lot more grey area there in the middle than with women's. And there's also a lot more, wow, big dominant man. You never see a submissive man in the media. It's all very big, strong, 6'5", 6-pack, that kind of thing. On both ends of the scale, I think some people view it as shameful for women to not have sex. People still view women's bodies as a commodity to be traded for all these disgusting reasons, and they say that if a woman isn't having sex, there is inherently something wrong with her. On the flip side, you have very conservative groups, some factions of some people in Parliament, not naming names, the Tories, who say that women just shouldn't have sex, that they should be just there for making babies and washing dishes, and it all goes hand in hand with that repression. And it's tough. It's really tough. I can't imagine being a woman, because you see all this shit on telly. Am I allowed to swear? Fantastic. I saw all this shit on telly about women being shamed for just doing what men have done for decades. And I'm just there like, why? It's just a different set of bits between the legs. I don't see the issue. Do you know what I mean? I think this is the most open we've ever been about female sexuality. I think it's fantastic that strong women are just able to go out there and say, look, I have sex. You know, someone like, I don't think she's funny or nice at all, but someone like Amy Schumer, you know, she's very popular, but all she does is go up and say, look, I'm a woman who has average sex, which men have been saying for years. You know, the number of like Chris Rock jokes back in the day, that kind of thing. But obviously we're progressing. And, you know, like I said earlier, we're always keeping going forward, and eventually we've always got to keep fighting the good fight, but there'll come a point where actually everything's equal and fine and it's all good.
I think female sexuality is a really difficult one because I think people view it in many different terms, in the sense that some people see it as in, are you heterosexual or are you a lesbian? It's not. And I think as well, because you don't say homosexual, you say lesbian, it's automatically almost a derogatory term. But we also look at things like what you wear on a night out and stuff, and how you produce or present your sexuality in that way. So like short skirts and showing your cleavage and things like that. So that's automatically focusing you on your sexuality. And obviously in fashion at the moment it's like proper low cut tops and things like that. But then again, that goes around negatively, because in like rape cases and stuff, people always go, well, it's what they were wearing and things like that, and it's almost like they were asking for it. Well, no, they were presenting their sexuality in a way that society wants them to, but at the same time they can't present them in that way, because when something negative happens to them, it's then their own fault. So it's really difficult, because there's always, no matter how we view female sexuality nowadays, there's always a negative side that's sort of lurking in the background. Just to get it in the mainstream media itself is a massive thing, to show that female sexuality doesn't just have to mean submitting yourself or being in a relationship with a guy. It can be whatever you want it to be. I think it's really interesting as well when you look back to history. So, you know, when you see female statues and ancient statues, all the females are naked. Everyone sort of embraces the fact they were very, it might have been seen as a sexual object, but they sort of embraced their sexuality, they let them show themselves. It's sort of beautiful, you would consider beautiful, and that was something to be celebrated. But then you go back 100 years ago and women had to completely cover up. I mean, showing your ankles was risque, and therefore how can you express your sexuality through your clothes or in how you feel when you've got to cover yourself completely? So I think 100 years ago was quite a tough time for women, because they couldn't show what they felt. And then you get to like the 1970s and Ann Summers comes along, and you can finally, in a way, women were finally liberated sexually, because they could wear risque underwear and no one would care. They could buy vibrators to please themselves. They could do whatever they wanted. And suddenly, okay, in the 70s it might not have been particularly accepted, but now it's like a cool thing, and it's very much embraced in women's magazines and things like that. You see, like, especially in like Cosmo and things like that, like how to achieve the perfect orgasm for a woman, and it's amazing, because you would have never have got that sort of coverage in the media and just widespread acceptance that females do have sexual needs 100 years ago. I never really thought about it when I was really young. I've realised there's a lot more out there than even when I was at secondary school. So I went to an all-girls school. Our PSD lessons, citizenship lessons, they were just on heterosexual relationships. They were very much, you know, make sure the guy's wearing a condom, this is how you put a condom on, don't get pregnant, you don't want to be young and pregnant. That was what our citizenship lessons taught us. So it was an all-girls school, very much, you know, heterosexual. And they didn't have a problem, because there were a few girls that were lesbians or homosexual, but they never really addressed that, and never really addressed how women might have, or you might have, different sexual needs. And so when I came to uni, suddenly this whole world sort of opened, because it wasn't just you're gay or you're straight. It was like you can have whatever, you know, there's homosexual, bisexual, pansexual. There were all these different terms, labels that you'd never heard of before. And suddenly it was almost like a whole world had sort of opened in female sexuality for me, that I was like, I'd never even known half of these were out there. Like, don't get me wrong, half the terms I was like, someone's going to have to explain this to me. But it was amazing because suddenly, yes, okay, I am heterosexual, but it was really good to know that for females that maybe aren't, there was stuff out there and that they might not have heard of before uni. And that's what, I suppose, why uni is such a great place to be. One of the things that really annoys me is if a guy sleeps with loads of people, he's a lad. If a girl sleeps with loads of people, she's a slut or a whore. And that really, really bugs me. Like, the double standard there is unreal. Like, it really irritates me. So I think that is one major thing. Why do we see girls' sexuality as something to be contained, something to almost be locked up, kept away, kept special for one guy? Yeah. I mean, I know that's a very, conservative, traditional view, but why can guys go around, sleep with anyone, and it's fine, and, then they can get married and have kids and have a very happy marriage anyway, whether they've slept with who knows what, but if the woman had, everyone would be like, won't go near her, she might give me chlamydia, or God knows, things like that. It really, really irritates me, and I think viewing men and women so differently is something we need to address. Until we address the issues the same way, until we do that, we're not going to move anywhere in progressing female sexuality to be even the same as men's. It's a very patriarchal society. Through history, it's always been a very patriarchal society. And it's really bad to say, but it's just the way we're socialised. And we don't know any different. But the good thing is, as time goes on, our attitudes are changing. And I think the more generations that come, the more progress we can make. But it is a historical thing. When you look back in history, men have always dominated, men have always ruled in society, in laws. So back in the early 20th century, women had no rights, not even to their children. The kids that they'd carried for 9 months, they didn't have any rights to them. It was always the men. So it is just a historical thing. I think there is still shame when it comes to female sexuality. I think when guys sit about and talk about their sexual conquest, their sexual encounters, it's not viewed in a bad way. Everyone's like, "Wait, that sounds great," blah blah blah. But females can't do that openly. So I lived in a house full of girls, second and third year, and I know the only time we really spoke about it, which is really interesting when I think about it, is when people were drunk, and that's the only time. And it must have all have been there, people wanting to talk about it. I think there is definitely still shame around it, and I know people that won't go into Ann Summers because it's seen as shameful to be I don't want to be seen as going in because then that shows that I might want a vibrator or something. Well, they sell underwear in there. You're going to have to get your underwear from somewhere, So there is definitely still shame around it, and I don't know how or when we could get rid of that, to be honest.
There are multiple ways our language phrases female sexuality as something mysterious, tantalising, and even a little dangerous. How the myth of Medusa goes being one of them, we also have the famous phrase, to open Pandora's box, often referring to female sexuality. And most of us get association to something mysterious and possibly dangerous once opened, something creating complications. And as some of my interviewees pointed out, it seems women are frequently categorised as either or, from two ends of a spectrum. I want to take you back to the myth of Medusa for a moment. It was actually said that 1 drop of Medusa's blood could be used for healing, but 2 would poison you to death. Perhaps there is a line to draw here, to female sexuality and how we view it. Maybe the control of female sexuality today lies in our societal norms for middle ground. Views on female sexuality has changed, in some areas more than others, and as earlier argued, maybe not all for the better. And as we have seen our perception change through the years, it will surely change in the years to come. One reason being that we are opening up for new ways to view gender in our society today. Before I leave you, I wanted to talk about an interesting fact I came across. It is to do with a vibrator, a famous token of female sexuality. But did you know where it comes from? It was actually originally used as a medical device to cure the disease hysteria. And the prescription of clitoral orgasm as a treatment for this disease actually dates back as far as to medical texts from the 1st century AD. And with that, if I may call it so, fun fact, I will leave you to your thoughts and comments. I would love to hear your thoughts on today's topic. You can reach me and comment on the podcast Twitter account Allie, Hairs and Shy, or go to my new blog About Allie on Tumblr. With a slight change of plans from what I promised in my first episode, I have posted the first segment of the short story series Allie, Her Hairs and Shy on there for you to read. Thank you for listening to my second podcast episode, Female Sexuality. I'm Alice. Until next time.